Let's jump right into it. Number 10. Willow bark tea for pain relief. Imagine you're living 4,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia and you've got a splitting headache. Your local healer hands you some bitter tea made from willow tree bark and tells you to drink up. You'd probably think they're crazy, but here's the mind-blowing part. That willow bark contains salicin, which your body converts into salicylic acid. Sound familiar? It should, because that's essentially aspirin. When German chemist Felix Hoffmann synthesized acetylsalicylic acid in 1897, he was basically creating a concentrated, purified version of what ancient healers had been prescribing for millennia. The Sumerians, Egyptians, and Native Americans all independently discovered the same remedy. Modern studies show willow bark extract can reduce pain and inflammation just as effectively as low-dose aspirin, with fewer stomach side effects. These ancient physicians weren't just throwing random plants at sick people, they were conducting the world's first clinical trials through generations of careful observation. Number 9. Maggot therapy for wound cleaning. This one's going to make your skin crawl, but stick with me because it's absolutely fascinating. Picture a Civil War battlefield surgeon in 1863, running low on supplies and watching soldiers die from infected wounds. Some desperate medics noticed something incredible. Soldiers whose wounds had been infested with certain types of maggots were actually healing better than those with clean bandages. It sounds like a medical horror story, but these physicians had stumbled onto one of nature's most effective surgical tools. Maggots don't just randomly eat flesh, they're incredibly sophisticated biological machines. Lucilia serracata maggots, specifically, only consume dead and infected tissue while leaving healthy tissue completely untouched. They secrete powerful antimicrobial substances that kill bacteria resistant to modern antibiotics, including MRSA. They also produce growth factors that stimulate healing. Today, medical-grade maggots are FDA-approved and used in hospitals worldwide. A single maggot can clean a wound more precisely than any surgeon's scalpel, consuming up to 15 times its body weight in necrotic tissue per day. Number 8. Digitalis from foxglove for heart conditions. Here's a story that reads like a medical detective novel. In 1775, English physician William Withering heard about an old woman in Shropshire whose herbal tea was supposedly curing people with dropsy, what we now call congestive heart failure. This wasn't some random folk remedy. This mysterious tea was literally bringing people back from death's door. Withering spent years tracking down this woman and discovering her secret ingredient, the purple foxglove plant. But here's where it gets really interesting. Foxglove contains cardiac glycosides, specifically digoxin and digitoxin, which directly affect the electrical conduction system of your heart. These compounds increase the force of heart muscle contractions while slowing the heart rate, essentially acting like a biological pacemaker and cardiac booster combined. The dosage window between therapeutic and toxic is incredibly narrow, which means this illiterate village healer had somehow figured out precise dosing through trial and error that took modern pharmacologists decades to understand. Today, digitalis-derived medications are still first-line treatments for heart failure and atrial fibrillation. That village woman's tea recipe became the foundation for cardiac medications that save millions of lives annually. Number 7. Opium poppy for pain management. Think about the most advanced pain management we have today, and you're probably imagining high-tech pharmaceuticals developed in sterile laboratories. Plot twist, we're still essentially using the same medicine that ancient Sumerians were cultivating 5,000 years ago. The opium poppy contains over 80 different alkaloids, but the big players are morphine, codeine, and the bane. Ancient physicians in Egypt, Greece, and Persia weren't just randomly chewing on poppy pods, they developed sophisticated extraction and preparation methods. They created different concentrations for different types of pain, understood tolerance and dependency issues, and even developed early addiction treatment protocols. Modern pharmaceutical science has spent 200 years trying to create synthetic alternatives that match the effectiveness of natural opium alkaloids while reducing addiction potential. Despite investing billions in research, we've never created anything more effective for severe pain than morphine, which is still extracted directly from poppies using methods that would be recognizable to ancient Persian physicians. The most advanced cancer pain management protocols still rely fundamentally on compounds that ancient healers identified through careful observation and experimentation. Number 6. Artemisia for malaria treatment. This story involves a discovery so important it won a Nobel Prize in 2015, but the real heroes are Chinese physicians from 1700 years ago. Tu Yaoyu was researching anti-malarial compounds in the 1960s when she stumbled across ancient Chinese medical texts describing a plant called qinghao, or sweet wormwood, used to treat intermittent fevers. But here's the fascinating part. When modern scientists first tried to extract active compounds from Artemisia using standard hot water extraction methods, they got nothing. The plant seemed completely inactive. Tu Yaoyu realized that ancient Chinese texts specifically mentioned using cold preparation methods, not hot ones. When she switched to cold ether extraction, she isolated artemisinin, one of the most powerful anti-malarial compounds ever discovered. This wasn't just lucky guessing by ancient physicians. They had somehow figured out that heat destroys the active compound. Artemisinin works by containing a peroxide bridge that gets activated by iron in malaria parasites, essentially creating targeted explosions inside infected cells while leaving healthy cells untouched. Those ancient Chinese doctors had identified a compound so sophisticated that it took modern chemistry decades to understand how it actually works. Number 5. Cocaine from coca leaves for anesthesia. Before you get the wrong idea, we're talking about legitimate medical use that revolutionized surgery. Andean indigenous peoples had been chewing coca leaves for over 4,000 years, not primarily for stimulant effects, but for altitude sickness, fatigue, and local pain relief. They developed incredibly sophisticated preparation methods, combining coca with alkaline substances like crushed seashells to increase bioavailability. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they initially dismissed coca use as primitive drug abuse, but quickly noticed something remarkable. Indigenous workers could perform physical labor at altitudes that would incapacitate Europeans, and they showed no signs of fatigue or altitude sickness. In 1859, German chemist Albert Niemann isolated cocaine from coca leaves, but it wasn't until 1884 that Karl Koller realized its potential as a local anesthetic. The first successful eye surgery using cocaine anesthesia was performed that same year, launching the era of modern surgery. Those Andean physicians had identified the world's first local anesthetic and developed delivery methods that maximized therapeutic effects while minimizing systemic absorption. Modern lidocaine and other local anesthetics are all synthetic derivatives designed to mimic cocaine's anesthetic properties without the addictive potential. Number 4. St. John's wort for depression. Mental health treatment feels like a thoroughly modern medical specialty, but ancient Greek physicians were prescribing remarkably effective antidepressants 2,000 years ago. Hypericum perforatum, known as St. John's wort, was used by Greek, Roman, and medieval physicians for what they called melancholia, what we now recognize as clinical depression. They didn't just randomly decide this yellow flower was good for sadness. They observed that patients showed consistent improvement in mood, sleep, and energy levels. Modern pharmacological research has revealed why this ancient remedy works so well. St. John's wort contains hypericin and hyperforin, compounds that inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, essentially acting as a broad-spectrum natural antidepressant. Clinical studies comparing St. John's wort to prescription SSRIs show equivalent effectiveness for mild to moderate depression, with significantly fewer side effects. The German health system actually prescribes St. John's wort more frequently than Prozac or Zoloft. Ancient physicians had identified and standardized a treatment that works through the exact same neurochemical pathways that modern psychiatry targets, but they did it through careful observation of patient responses rather than understanding of brain chemistry. Number 3. Echinacea for immune system support. Native American tribes across the Great Plains didn't have access to modern immunology textbooks, but they developed one of the most effective immune system modulators in natural medicine. Echinacea was used by the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche tribes for infections, wounds, and what they described as weakness of the spirit. European settlers initially dismissed these practices as superstition until they started noticing something incredible. Native Americans using echinacea preparations showed remarkable resistance to infectious diseases that were decimating European immigrant populations. Modern immunological research has revealed that echinacea contains alkamides, glycoproteins, and polysaccharides that directly stimulate various components of the immune system. It increases production of white blood cells, enhances natural killer cell activity, and boosts interferon production. But here's the really sophisticated part. Different echinacea species contain different concentrations of active compounds, and Native American healers had identified which species worked best for which types of infections. Echinacea purpurea for respiratory infections, Echinacea angustifolia for wound healing, Echinacea pallida for systemic immune support. They had essentially created the world's first targeted immunotherapy protocols without understanding anything about T, cells, or cytokines. Number 2. Taxol from Pacific Yew for cancer treatment. This discovery story reads like a medical thriller with a tragic twist. Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest had been using Pacific yew bark preparations for various ailments for centuries, but they considered the tree sacred and used it sparingly. In 1962, the U.S. National Cancer Institute launched a massive screening program, testing thousands of plant compounds for anti-cancer properties. The Pacific yew was almost overlooked because it's such a slow-growing tree that harvesting seemed impractical. When researchers finally isolated paclitaxel, known as Taxol, they discovered one of the most powerful cancer-fighting compounds ever found. Taxol works by stabilizing microtubules in cancer cells, essentially freezing their ability to divide and replicate. It's particularly effective against ovarian, breast, and lung cancers. But here's the heartbreaking irony. Extracting enough Taxol to treat a single cancer patient required harvesting bark from 6 mature Pacific yew trees, each of which takes 200,300 years to reach maturity. The pharmaceutical industry was literally destroying ancient forests to access a medicine that indigenous peoples had been using sustainably for generations. Fortunately, scientists eventually figured out how to synthesize Taxol from more common yew species and even produce it using engineered bacteria. Number 1. Penicillin from bread mold. This is the discovery that changed everything, but Alexander Fleming wasn't the first person to notice that certain molds could fight infections. Ancient Egyptian physicians regularly applied moldy bread to infected wounds, and similar practices existed in China, Greece, and medieval Europe. These weren't desperate attempts by primitive people. These were established medical protocols passed down through generations of healers who had observed consistent positive results. The difference is that ancient physicians didn't understand why moldy bread worked, they just knew that it did. When Fleming accidentally contaminated bacterial cultures with Penicillium notatum in 1928, he was essentially rediscovering something that folk healers had been using for thousands of years. What made Fleming's discovery revolutionary wasn't just identifying penicillin's antibiotic properties, but developing methods to purify and mass produce it. Ancient healers were limited to topical applications of unpredictable potency, while modern medicine could create standardized doses for systemic infections. But think about this. Those ancient physicians had identified the most important antibiotic in human history using nothing but careful observation and empirical testing. They noticed that certain types of mold consistently prevented wound infections, standardized preparation methods, and taught these techniques across cultures and continents. Modern penicillin saved millions of lives during World War II and launched the antibiotic age. But it all started with ancient healers who understood that nature had already solved the problem of bacterial infections. That's all for now. I'll make similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.